Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Tap into Magic podcast. So, today, I kind of wanted to go over a pretty hot topic as of today, actually, or I guess the day after that you're seeing this. Um, Today, what just announced was the new bracket system. Like the official beta release, more than just, hey, we're doing brackets at some point, which was pretty big, pretty huge thing for Commander, sort of the foundation for what new Commander is going to be after this, committee change that we had, I think late last year, early this year. So kind of see, this beginning shift in power and what that really changes the dynamic of the game and, the sort of relationship between the players and, WotC. So they've kind of rolled out this thing here. And just to preface all that I'm going to be saying here, I'm not going to go super far in depth into the bracket system in this video, just because there's a lot to talk about. And I kind of want to talk more about my opinions on it rather than the basis of what it is. I'll still give sort of a brief overview, but if you really want to make sure and kind of see all this for yourself, especially with the whole game changer list, I will leave a link to both Gavin Verhey's article in the description and the Command Zone podcast episode on that, because I feel like it very succinctly sort of puts everything together in a very easy and understandable way. With that out of the way, let's kind of get into it. So, I think originally they rolled out 4 brackets, or they were kind of thinking of 4 brackets, but today we have 5 brackets as sort of our basis jumping off point. So we got 1 through 5, 1 being kind of a pile of cards that may have some sort of synergy, all the way up to 5 being CDH, which is really cool. And I'm glad that they've included that as a bracket in the system within Commander rather than trying to be a whole separate system, kind of by itself. I think it's good that, they're kind of all encompassing here, especially with the fact that some of these committee members are also, big CDH players and big, advocates for that community. It's good to see kind of all of it together rather than being segmented like that. So yeah, bracket 1 is a sort of, it's very Vorthosy. It's very much, at least the way everyone I've heard describe it, as more of like, I have a theme to the deck that's not really trying to win, but wants to pull something off, or that is just, a collection of cards like horses, or have certain artwork, or, what have you. It's more about creating a deck full of things rather than anything else. And I have to say, I have built one of these decks actually very recently, which kind of gives me a cool frame of reference for this. I built a Yearlock deck. It's a kind of a Jund Mana Burn deck, more Voltron-y, based on the artist, I believe, Jesper Icing. I think I pronounced that right. I think he's a Swedish guy. Kind of a hard to pronounce name. Might have butchered that. But I built the entire deck with just cards that he had made art for. Just kind of because I really like the artwork. I really like the artist, and he put out a new Secret Lair with some cool stuff in it. But the deck isn't crazy good. There's a lot of commons and uncommons that don't do a whole lot. Not crazy synergy. Some good cards here and there, or at least vaguely okay cards, and almost no. I think there was 3 non-basic lands. Thankfully, he did basic land cycle for Ikoria, but I think, yeah, not a lot of bacons in terms of mana fixing. So that I would probably consider a bracket 1 deck, because it's more about the flavor of the cards rather than the cards themselves, or even really the game. It's more about, hey, look at this cool thing I have, than trying to win or put something together. So it's way more based on flavor than mechanics, hence the more Vorthos aspect of things. So that's kind of bracket 1. The more like strict rules is no extra turns. I think few extra turns. I think 0 extra turns is what they're looking for here. None of the game changer cards, which I'll kind of go a little bit over later. Not too much, just because it's a whole list of 40 cards. Instead of me rattling them off and kind of go look at them. And then no mass land destruction. That's something that they've really kind of put together, which I think they put together more of a mass land denial, because they wanted to include stuff not just like Armageddon, but also Winter Orb, anything that denies you mana. I think there were like 4 or more lands either stay tapped or get destroyed or whatever at one time. So your Armageddons, your Jackal Hopses, your World Fires, your like Winter Orbs, Blood Moon, that sort of thing, that just turns off lands or makes them unusable in some sort of way. So that's kind of our base level there. They even said like most decks are not going to fall into this, and a lot of people haven't even ever made these type of decks just because it's a very specific subsect of people. But it's kind of the edge case. We need the full spectrum if we're going to make if they're going to have this whole all encompassing sort of commander list. So that's kind of the basis there. And then they have bracket 2, which they said is kind of the average level precon. So your like standard release precons, not like the Modern Horizons ones or Lord of the Rings ones. So you're just your standard, if you averaged all the commander decks of recent years, this would kind of be a 2. At least that's kind of the thing that we're being told it should be around this level. And at this level, you're only running 1 or 2, maybe 3 extra turn effects, but they cannot be looped or, non-chainable. So you're not playing Time Warp into another, spell, Alrund's Epiphany or whatever. You're just, playing 1 or 2 at most. No tutors is also another thing that they're adding to these lower level brackets, including 1 or very, very few tutors. And they're saying that does not include like all of your land tutors. Those do not count as tutors. They're more fetchable cards rather than that, not the same level as like a demonic tutor. So stuff like that, no combos, nothing like that. So this is kind of the basic stuff, and still no game changer cards. So you're just playing at the average power level. And I do think, kind of weirdly, some of these game changer cards do appear in precons, which they have already talked about. And the fact that, a big part of this bracket list is it's still just sort of a supplement for the Rule Zero conversation and that sort of time to be like, okay, what are we playing? Let's try to match power levels. It's never going to be a perfect system. It can't ever be a perfect system because there's too many cards in the game and everything's a little bit different. Each deck is different and the way that they play is different and the power levels are different. So just because you're running a Jessica's Will or Demonic Tutor or, any sort of thing like that, you're not immediately, a super high powered deck. And that is a lot of thing I know people were sort of talking about even before this got announced was like, oh, so if I'm running, an Ancient Tomb or some sort of like fast mana, like one piece of it in my kind of janky deck, does that make me automatically this tier of deck? Which no, that's something to talk and sit down with. You're like, hey, I have this precon. It's a precon right out of the box, but it does include a Jessica's Will or whatever, or the Trouble in Pairs, whatever it happens to be, that is a game changer card. And most of the time you're going to be all right. It's just trying to, stay the course and kind of give people those guiding lines to kind of work between. And another big part of this that I really want to shout out sort of early in the video here is the fact that, especially looking at the stream that this was all announced on, Gavin was very much imploring everyone to give feedback. And that's one really big thing is, spark these discussions, get people out here talking about it, their thoughts and opinions, what they think they should add to this, what they shouldn't, just feedback from the community. Because that was such a big, thing and sort of a pitfall of the previous system we had sort of towards the end, which sparked all of this change, was the fact it was kind of out of nowhere and people, didn't feel represented. And that's kind of what, had all this anger. And I think that's what they're really, really trying to make sure that does not happen again. They're trying to make sure history does not repeat with this by being like, hey, we know you guys, want a voice in this. And so make sure you do have one. You make sure, go, at Gavin or whatever, go look up their handles, go check them out. I'm going to go look at their links in the description that I'm leaving and go talk to those guys, make sure that your voice is heard. And that's kind of a big part of it here. But let's move along to a bracket 3, which is kind of the median. It's that middle bracket. It's what most decks and most Commander players are probably going to fall into around. That was one thing after looking at the Command Zone podcast I don't totally agree with. They were saying most decks are probably going to be a 2, and I do think quite a few are going to be a 3. At least, I've been to a few LGSs around, and my main LGS is one that has a lot of different people rotating in and out. And I do think majoritively, especially because Commander is just getting more powerful, that people are going to be running 1 or 2 game changer cards, and they're going to have the sort of higher power stuff, just slightly, not to the point where you're getting towards the CDH level, but I think 3 really is mostly that median between like a 2.5 and 3. Really, I think that's kind of the area where I've at least seen a lot of the people around my sample size kind of leaning towards, where they're going to have a little bit in there. But yeah, basically, tier 3 is where we start playing with game changer cards. So you get to play with 3 per deck. That is the limit they put on it. And I'll kind of talk a little bit about the game changer cards. So they've got them listed by, there's 40 of them. They wanted to start with kind of a round number. Not too many, but just enough that they kind of can curve stuff out and kind of allow people to shape their decks around it. So they've got them, quite a lot for blue, a good amount for black. Colorless is basically a bunch of fast mana. It's a multicolored, everything from all the colors. Not a whole lot of red, but it's basically just kind of as a general overview, kind of the staples or just really, really strong cards of those colors. White has Drannith Magistrate, Enlightened Tutor, Staxy pieces or just really, really good pieces. Smothering Tide, Trouble in Pairs. You got Rhystic Study, Thassa's Oracle, just because will Underworld Breach, all these things. And Black has like a lot of the high end tutors, like Imperial Seal, Demonic Tutor, Vamp Tutor, all as not banned cards, but cards that are just considered on this Game Changer list, so that they're really only trying to be played in brackets 3 and above. And then they also do have, the colorless stuff, the One Ring, Trinisphere is a stacks piece, just the stuff that they want, as the name kind of implies, that are kind of game changing and really do make the whole, game sort of focus around that card specifically, which I do understand that design philosophy, though I don't fully agree with the cards on this list. Based on all of the factors of a game. If you're just looking strictly, hey, what are the cards available in the format, and maybe kind of what people play, then I understand sort of the stuff on here, but not everything I agree with as needs to be on this list. Like, yes, maybe if it was played to the extent that I don't know, maybe the sample group that the people putting this together had, the committee or what, I forget what they're called now. I'm gonna call them the committee because I can't fully remember. It's another new name that's sort of similar to that. I think it's the commander panel. That might be correct, but my sample size might be slightly different from them. But certain cards on here, like the ones that really stand out to me, are, for one, Grim Monolith. I almost never see, and honestly, I don't know. I feel like it's not that bad of a card because you're paying 2 mana, getting 3. Like, it's, especially because we have Soul Ring, and that's the one card that, of course, is going to stay off this list, and that is so ubiquitous. It's in everything. That's the card that they vowed to never touch because it's kind of our golden goose, our the pinnacle and kind of the staple of Commander. Grim Monolith, for one, I think it's gotta be $100-$200 at this point. It's really shot up over time. I've only ever seen them in either very high power, what I guess you consider now bracket 4 pods already, or just straight up CDH, because that one extra colorless mana one time is really not that good. It's not good enough, and I really don't see it enough. And I think that price point, like people, other ones on here, like I understand Chrome Mox or Mana Vault or, all of these, Mox Diamond, Ancient Tomb, like these make a lot more sense because not only did they net you more mana, but comparatively to Grim Monolith, they're not as expensive. So I don't really think something like Grim Monolith is going to see much play outside of CDH, and doesn't really already, because the minimal amount of advantage that it gives you is not really worth that much outside of CDH. You don't need that extra leg up, that tiny little bit, unless you're playing at the absolute power level where every little advantage you can is absolutely needed. So I really don't think that needs to be on here. It just does not make a whole lot of sense to me. Another one is Lion's Eye Diamond. This one's kind of a weird one. I think this, I wouldn't say it shouldn't be on here because I have seen quite a few, and people do the Underworld Breach Lion's Eye combos with Brain Freeze or whatever. That's more of a thing. Still definitely a CDH thing, but at the same time, I feel like Lion's Eye Diamond, unless you're running a dedicated deck in that higher end range, it's not really worth running, both because of price point. It's an extremely expensive card, $400, $500, $600, depending on where you're getting it. And it makes you discard your whole hand. And so unless you are already in that combo deck and you're that high level pod, you're not seeing these all too often. Like, I really don't see this card almost ever. Another one that I understand on here is Glacial Chasm. It's not that expensive of a card, and there's enough sort of good landfall support and lands matter decks that can run this very easily that it makes sense this is on here. I've lost to it from a game-winning perspective just because it's on the field and they could recur it, and there's no way for me to get around it. That makes sense that it's on here. Another really, really weird one that I definitely think should be removed almost immediately is the Tabernacle at Pendrell Vale. Purely because I have never once seen this card ever. Competitive does not run this card. I've seen it one time in a very janky colorless Liberator deck that was stacks. And that was the one time I ever saw someone run a Tabernacle, and I don't think that it ever even came out. It's just a card that is so absurdly expensive. It's on the sort of that borderline power 9 level of expense, $3,000-$4,000, that it's just not going to show up at tables because people cannot afford it. And I know people do proxy and that sort of thing, but if you're going to an LGS that has officially sanctioned tournaments, you cannot run those proxies. So at these events, where you're getting the most amount of people together, and where you have these problems of, needing that rule zero conversation, the whole point of the bracket system, I don't think you're ever going to show, a Tabernacle is never going to come up. It is just too expensive of a card. And it's one of those stack speeds that people don't even like running most of the time. Like, you have to be in a very, very specific deck that's trying to do something very absurd for this card to even really matter all that much. Like, I guess Super Friends, but even then, like, no Super Friends card is going to be like, oh yeah, I need to add in Tabernacle because it's a pretty good card for this deck. Super Friends is not a competitive archetype by any means, so it doesn't really make a lot of sense there. It's just not a card that I would ever expect really should be on this list, and I don't think that there's no point. It's too pricey and it's too specific that it doesn't make any sense here. Another one, I do understand putting Gaia's Cradle on here. Of course, Tolarian Academy is still banned, and I don't think it should be unbanned, even with these game changers, kind of changing the way that they're going to be doing unbannings. But Serra's Sanctum is another card that just, I don't know, I've never seen this card once. It's one of those that I do, like, I've seen some pretty, high-end dedicated enchantment decks, and it's just not a card that's really high on the list to run. Like, Gaia's Cradle, it is, a lot more expensive than Serra's Sanctum. I think about doubly so, if not a little bit more. But Gaia's Cradle has way more general value. Way more decks are going to be playing creatures in general that are in green. You're going to be able to, crap out a bunch of creatures all at once to use that mana than, your specifically white Enchantress decks. I just don't think Serra's Sanctum is sort of like Tabernacle in that way, where it's very, very pricey for any really Enchantress deck to want to go into it. And at the same time, it's that exact same thing where the Enchantress decks aren't usually the competitive decks. Like, at least in the meta I've seen, white isn't really the color that, you're getting your mana from. It's pretty much every other color that really matters in. And yeah, I don't know. I just think it's one of those cards that it's not going to show up enough. And Gaia's Cradle as well, it's way easier to get out a bunch of creatures to net a whole bunch of mana. Serra's Sanctum, unless you're specifically trying to play this card so that you're playing, your Authority Consuls and your Blind Obediences and your small little enchantments to be able to make a lot of mana, you're not really getting a lot of value. And in the same vein, this is a really hard card to tutor for, to actually try to get out to kind of build around in those, white, mono white decks. So I don't really see a reason for this to be on here. And I know that they went through a lot of debate, and there's probably a lot of reasons on their end that this should be, on the game changers list, but it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me personally. And I've just never, in my personal experience, ever seen it even show up. Another one that I think people have contested a lot is the Drannith Magistrate. I understand it, and I've played this enough, myself and both playing against it. People are like, oh, but it stops Cascade decks and whatever, which is usually never the case. Like, you're not putting this in a deck to deal with Cascade stuff. This is a stack piece, and you're like, oh, it slows people down. It's like, that is never what this is really being used for. This is almost solely a card to make sure that your opponents can't cast their commanders. Like, that is really what it comes down to, which is a very strong card, don't get me wrong. That's a huge thing. And a lot of decks, especially around that sort of mid-power level, really do rely on their commanders to be out to really get the max value out of their decks, or sometimes any value out of their decks. So I really do think, and this is played, more competitively, so it makes sense at that point. But I don't understand people that want this to come off. I do think it's very much a card on here that is a game changer. It just changes the entire game, and a lot of time can stop the game in its tracks. It's one of those stacks pieces that, people try to make other arguments, but it's definitely, it shuts down commanders too much. It's the same reason why Karakas will never be unbanned, because it's just way too good against specifically legendary creatures. And there's a few others in here. Another kind of weird one I saw was Force of Will. So I don't know. Force of Will and Fierce Guardianship are on here, which I do understand to a degree, because both of them, it does change the game. If you know your opponent is running 0-mana counter spells, the game is changed in the way that you never know whether or not they're actually tapped out or shields down. You have to play around a lot more with those two cards very specifically, because they're able to cast those cards for free. So you can never be like, okay, the blue player's tapped out, or I can make them tap out for this or whatever, and kind of have that information. So it is very much less casual cards. Though I guess they are, their counter spells are kind of specific, and to have that very specific part of the game sort of put behind this wall, I don't super see. I think they are, like, I don't know if I would specifically take them off the list, just because I do understand where they are and they are powerful spells, but I think counter spells in specific, because they're not a value engine on their own. They're just kind of that one time stacks piece. At best, I don't think it's that bad. Though I do understand the reasons why they put it on here. Same thing with Urza, Lord High Artificer. That's just a very easy combo card. Makes sense it's on here. Expropriate is kind of another weird one, though I do understand it, though, because it is basically, hey, I win the game. Though for 9 mana, it's that's a lot to pay to get this spell out, even if it is 1, 2, 3 extra turns. Though I do understand putting also behind that wall, because they're wanting to keep out of those lower levels those extra turn spells, and so just by the nature of the way that they set up their bracket system, this card wouldn't be allowed to be played in under bracket 3, so making it a game changer makes sort of sense in that way. So I kind of understand where that is. Thassa's Oracle is a card that I said just should be straight up banned, and I'm a competitive player, and I run it in some of my competitive stuff. I just think it's so format warping to the point where I haven't played a whole lot of competitive lately, because it's too homogenous. It's sort of that Flash Hulk thing where it's just, well, maybe turn 1, turn 2, or turn 3, I'm just dead to this one very specific combo, and it doesn't really feel like they do. I don't know if it's kind of harsh to say they don't deserve the win, because of course, CDH, you're trying to do what you're trying to do. But I feel like even with, your Underworld Breach combos, you still have to, get there. You need to have the stuff in your hand or tutor for it or whatever, to get it, going. And Thassa's Oracle is just one of those that it's so straight up win for usually 3-4 mana, that I don't know, it's too warping. And I think it makes it to where if you're not playing the 1 or 2 cookie cutter Grixis shells or Izzet shells or whatever, it's not as fun to play competitive with this in the format, I think. And I think competitive would be better off without it. And one last thing I will talk about here, I know I've kind of talked in length on a lot of these. I do have some sort of opinions on them, though. I will leave the full link, list of the full list in the link below, so you can go check that out. It's also going to be in the Gavin's article as well, to go check that out. It's going to be all over the place, so you should be able to find it pretty easy with some of those links. But the multicolored aspect to this is basically just 4 really powerful commanders, which I do have to say makes sense. It's Kinnan, Bonner, Prodigy, Yuriko, the Tiger Shadow, Winota, Joiner Forces, and Grand Arbiter Augustine IV. So all 4 of these, kind of minus Grand Arbiter, is those are 3 of the most popular competitive commanders. So it makes sense. They're just so generically good that they are going to just be more powerful than a lot of other stuff. And so it makes sense that 3 and above, this is kind of where you want this to be played. And one thing that people were asking about is that these do count as one of your 3 game changers. So if you are running this as a commander, you automatically only have 2 other slots left. So you kind of got to be careful with that. And Grand Arbiter is just one of those cards that's an immediate stacks piece. I understand kind of why it's on here. There's not a lot of other commanders that just say, hey, the game is harder now. So I do get why it's on here, and I understand why all 4 of these are on here. One that I'm honestly more surprised that this isn't a slightly bigger list, because just judging by the criteria of those 4 cards in specific, especially the more competitive commanders, I'm surprised we haven't seen, people were talking about like Tymna not being on here because it's just so generically good as a partner commander. Or honestly, I'm thinking even Thracia is like that. It's such insane. It's kind of on that level of Kinnan, combos in a Kinnan deck at the same time of just, it's such a high power and very competitive, viable card. And sort of the last one is Najeela, because, even though I think she's sort of fallen from grace as sort of the top competitive commander, she has that sort of level of just, I'm going to win the game based on the commander being so good and usually better than everyone else's, because it's just so synergized. But other than that, like those few different things, I don't really have too many problems with this list here. I think it's fairly well put together, and I agree with most of it. There's just a few things I might change here and there, which is totally what they're asking for, and I kind of want to put that out there. But yeah, so that is basically the game changer list. So going back to bracket 3, that I talked about way earlier on. So bracket 3, you can run 3 of these cards. You can start to use a few more tutor spells, I believe. Just that average power level. where you put more stables into your deck. You're more optimized, and that's kind of what I see this as. Is this is sort of like an optimized precon where you're like, okay, I'm taking some sort of precon from like Bloomburrow, like the Bellow precon. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna take out the bad enchantments, put in good artifacts and enchantments, or make this optimized to where it does a lot more for me. Or like I'm taking Chatterfang in the Squirrels deck and making that the commander, and kind of running with that as more of a higher power and higher end deck. So that kind of thing. That's kind of where I see this myself, as sort of just this, okay, we're really sort of starting to look at what are the best cards for this archetype, rather than just, hey, here's this deck that I have and I'm using cards laying around to make it. So that's kind of where I see the separation there. And then the kind of big jump is with bracket 4 is the fact that it's no holds barred. So run your mass land destruction. You can run any number of game changers, whatnot. And one people were having problems with this, and sort of the blurred line between 4 and 5, going from that bracket 4 to CDH, which I don't super understand, because I think it's a pretty simple sort of dichotomy between the two, where I think this is just sort of play what you want. It's more of that sandbox where you can kind of be like, okay, I just happen to run a good amount of staples in my deck. And yes, it's pretty well optimized. I think this is sort of just that next level after the upgraded precon, or this is like the super finely tuned precon, where it's like, okay, I've taken out pretty much all the cards that don't relate specifically to what I'm doing. And, I'm running a lot more staples, and I'm kind of getting to the win con a lot faster. I don't think this needs to be completely, and that was one thing that they added in bracket 3 was, doing more combo stuff, and that's what they're keeping out of 1 and 2 is no two card combos, and then bracket 3 is like maybe 1 or 2 of those, or maybe 3 card combos, whatever. And these are all, of course, very vague rules, just to make sure that you're not Thassa's Oracle demonic consultation sort of thing. And so I think bracket 4 is sort of that just next step of like, okay, I don't have to worry about limiting the power level of my deck. I can just be like, okay, I like my really expensive, powerful cards. I'm just going to run those. And I think that's more of it, at least to me, because I do have a few power, bracket 4 decks where it's like, okay, this is just a good deck with a lot of good stuff into it. So like, at the same time, I'm going to be releasing tomorrow an Emery deck list, which I would consider bracket 4, because it has a lot of good fast mana, a lot of good artifacts, and it's got a good amount over 3 game changers, though it doesn't necessarily relate to CDH in any way. Like, I think it would get crushed in most CDH pods. And another thing that the people were talking about, sort of to find this difference between 4 and 5, is the fact that 5 is going to be running a lot more interaction, is going to be more interaction based. And one thing that they talked about on the Command Zone podcast was the fact that some of these lower tier decks might actually be able to win in a CDH pod, because CDH is meant to beat and play against CDH. You're running very specific stuff. Like, you're not probably going to be running Mental Misstep unless you're in a CDH pod. Same thing with Pyroblast. You don't see that all the time, because you're very much specifically looking at blue spells, or even Veil of Summer, that sort of thing. You're just not seeing all that very much outside of CDH too much, because you're very much focused on counter spells and the very specific interaction pieces that are there. So that's also another part of separation is, like the Emery deck that I do have that I would consider bracket 4 does not have a whole lot of counter spells. I do have one free counter spell, but it's Pact of Negation. I have some interaction, but it's just a very highly tuned deck that can kind of get where it wants to go, and just has really good cards. There's just not a whole lot of weak cards in the deck. And I think that's more of it to me, is where it's just, okay, we're getting to the level where there's just a lot going on. And yes, your curve goes down, but that does not necessarily mean that this is a highly competitive deck. I just think that there is that sort of leeway of like, okay, and that's something that they wanted to really make with this, was the fact that bracket 4 is not bracket 5. There is a difference between high level casual play and competitive play. And that's another part of it, is competitive play is competitive for a reason. They're sitting there to win. That's kind of the antithesis of the bracket 1. Bracket 1 is all about flavor and not about the game. And bracket 5, CDH, is all about the game and not about the flavor. You're not running cards because you have a theme, which you can still do in bracket 4. When I built my Emery deck initially. I just wanted to run a bunch of cool, 0 mana or, little mana spells to be able to get out Emry. And, I just wanted to do generic, really cool artifact stuff. And that deck just sort of ramped up to the point where it's really highly tuned. She just happens to be a really strong commander that can do a lot of good stuff. So I kind of think that's part of it, of like, I could play Emry, and it's more still about the archetype that I'm playing around rather than, hey, I'm trying to win every single time. That deck is not, it does have combos in it, but that's not to say that's the sole thing it does either. So yeah, that's sort of the main overview of all of them. One, your generic random pile of cards. I think these look cool, and so I'm putting them in here. Two, your precons. Your general level stuff where a lot of stuff is going to fall. Your more casual side of players. Tier 3, bracket 3, sort of being your more optimized build. Precons or just high, slightly higher level where you're putting more into it. Tier 4 being no holds barred. Put all your really powerful stuff in here, kind of go wild. And then Tier 5 being like, okay, serious business. We're getting down to it, and we're going to be trying to win at any cost possible. And at least to me, that is what I see overarching as sort of the view of all of these. And I do think it is a little hard to fully kind of grasp all parts of it because, for one, this just released today, and like I haven't even gone to my LGS yet. And so sort of seeing how this turns out and how people sort of interpret it, that's going to be the big part of it. Because, for a long time, the joke was, oh, hey, my deck's a 7. And, therefore, every single deck is a 7 because we didn't really know how to put all that together. And I do think, comparatively to that, kind of arbitrary 1 through 10 power level ranking system, this is a huge step in the right direction. I think that's what kind of the consensus is from a lot of people, is the fact that this is something kind of a better guideline, and sort of that icebreaker into the rules of your conversation of like, okay, what's in this deck? And that was something, a lot of people are even talking about sort of this new bracket system, sort of drawing from Canadian Highlander, where Canadian Highlander does have, a ban list, but it's very, very small. There's not a lot of banned cards. Most of the cards are actually just restricted behind a point wall, where, you have 10 points to your deck, and you have this list of cards that are pointed that you take up so many points in your deck. So like Black Lotus is 7 points. I think Ancestral Recall is 8, and that sort of thing, where you only have so many points to expend, and so you can put really good cards, some of the best cards in the game in your deck, but you can only add so many, which I think is kind of what they're trying to parody with that sort of tier bracket 3 level of deck, where it's like, okay, you can have 3 of these. You can have 3 pointed cards in your deck at any time. They're all worth the same amount of points, but here you are. You can kind of do that, which for me personally, I think is an awesome building deck restriction, where I really do like it, where it's like, okay, I can only run these certain cards, and like even companions, I think is really fun in that way of like, okay, I have to kind of build around this, and I think that's what really sparks creativity, especially when you've played for a while and you've played, kind of all the power levels of the game. You're like, okay, how can I challenge myself to build something and still have it be fun or have it be powerful and have it work well? Just sort of within that vein. I do think it's a great jumping off point. I'm really excited to see, what other feedback everyone else gives. And I do also very much recommend that everyone here that is watching the video go, leave in the comments below here and, in the article, and add everyone, go over to the Command Zone podcast. Just leave all of your comments around. And I would love to hear from you guys kind of what you think about this whole thing, especially after you've gone out and seen all of these lists, this whole 40 card list for yourself, and, that super in-depth breakthrough down of all of the different brackets, kind of what people are looking for. I think it's an awesome system, and I think it's a really good start. I know a lot of people are pessimistic just because Magic players like to be that, especially online, but I do think this is an awesome step in the right direction. I think they're really, and that's one thing, is that people are pouring their heart and soul into making this work, because everyone loves the Commander format. This is very much done with love and for care of the format. Gavin, and everything I've seen with him, I've seen him at conventions and whatnot, he just seems like an awesome dude that really wants to make sure this game works and that it works well. So yeah, besides that, I really do hope everyone here has enjoyed the episode. I will leave a link also in the description below, not only to all of those different articles and things, but also to the playlist of the entire podcast. So you can go check that out, look at all the other videos, and make sure to stay tuned for more in the near future. But yeah, besides all that, I will see all of you in the next one.